All right, so what we're going to work on in this section is to do an organization of the data with a graph. All right. So in your notes, write down the statistical graph, and then let's jot down the 3 types that we're going to talk about. And you probably want to just maybe leave like 2 or 3 lines in between, okay, because we're going to fill in some information. Okay, so the graphs aren't really that difficult to set up. One thing that makes it a little bit hard is that the names that they use for the graphs are not names that we're familiar with. Like when I say histogram, I'm guessing that you don't get a picture of a graph popping into your head, okay? But if I were to say bar graph, you do get that picture, right? You guys know what a bar graph looks like? Okay. So remember that a histogram is a type of bar graph. And that'll help you sort of have a picture in your head of what it is you're trying to draw. Okay, and then the other thing you need to know, when we draw the graph, we're going to be putting some information across the bottom, and then we're going to be putting some information on the side. And so you need to know what information goes across the bottom and what information goes up on the side so that you can set it up correctly. All right, so we're going to use the class boundaries across the x-axis. So that's the one going across from left to right at the bottom. And then we're going to put the frequencies on the y-axis. That's going up. All right, so again, to do a histogram, that's kind of your basic information. You got to know what looks like a bar graph. You got to know what to put across the bottom and what to put up the side, right? All right, we're going to get the same kind of information down for the other 2. All right, but first we're going to go ahead and look at setting up a histogram. All right, so keep in mind that what we need in order to do it, we need boundaries and we need frequencies, all right? So here's the example that we're going to use for all 3 of the graphs. So you can see that they're giving us the limits and the frequency. So you may want to, in your notes, we're only going to work on this example, you may want to take a minute and write down the limits and the frequency, and then we'll work on it. You don't have to necessarily write the sentence at the top where it says we're studying SAT scores, but I would probably jot down the actual problem. So you have the limits and the frequency. All right. So we said that we needed to have the boundaries and the frequencies for the graph, right? Okay, so we have the frequencies. So this part's going to be good. We got that. We don't have the boundaries. All right, so on my example, somewhere on where you wrote this down, we're going to add a column for the boundaries. All right, so we talked about this the other day when we were doing the frequency distribution. So we're going to go back over it, but you really should at this point know how to get your boundaries from the classes. Remember, your boundaries have to end in a 0.5. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start over here. All right, we're going to start over here on the left. Okay, with those numbers. So the 800, the 875, the 950, the 1025, the 1100. Remember that we go a little bit less than those. All right, so what do I have for a little bit less than 800?
799.
Good. 799, that's less than 800. And then remember that it has to end in a 0.5. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for all 5 of those numbers. We're going to come just a little bit less. So 875 is going to become 874. And then we're going to put that 0.5 on the end. Okay, are you guys okay with that? Okay, everybody at home, are you okay doing boundaries on the left-hand side? Coming in a little bit less and then putting that 0.5 in there. Anybody have a question with that? All right, so we'll go ahead and finish these 3 up. Okay, and then I'm going to move on and do the right-hand side of the boundary. So remember that these are a little bit more, right? Okay, so what do I have for 874 if I'm going just a little bit more? Almost. We're going to just take the number that we have, 874, and we're going to put a 0.5 on the end of it there. Okay, and if you've done this right, you should start to see some overlap. Okay, notice that like right here and right here, those are the same numbers. Okay, so one of the purposes of the boundaries is it sort of fills in this gap. Like in the limits, you go from 874 to 875, you have a little bit of a gap in between those numbers. So the boundary is supposed to fill that in. And so you should see it overlap when you're doing them, if you're doing them correctly. All right, so the next one, we're going to take this 949 and we're going to tack a 0.5 on it. That makes it a little bit more. All right, are we okay with that? Everybody at home okay with that? All right. So now we have the boundaries and we have the frequency and we're ready to draw our graph. All right, so let's do it then. Let's go and we'll take our histogram. So I've just transferred our information over. We've got our boundaries.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's back on the other. Well, you can keep it on there. How did you get 1174.5 at the end of class boundaries?
Okay, so you're going to take this 1174 right here, and you're going to go just a little bit more. And going just a little bit more means that you're going to tack on a 0.5 on the end.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so go ahead and draw your graph, your axis across and your axis down, and then we're going to look at actually setting up this histogram. Okay, so remember that we want boundaries to go across the bottom. We don't need to repeat any number. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mark off 6 tick marks across the bottom, and I'm gonna try to get them as evenly spaced as I can. And then I'm gonna put my numbers down. Okay, so I'm gonna start with the 799.5. And then I'm going to move over to the 874.5. And then when I move down to the next class, notice that we've got a duplication here. So I don't need to put that again because I already have the 874.5. All right, so I can move on to the next different number, which is 949.5. All right, and then 1024.5. $99.5 and 1174.5. All right, we need a label on the bottom. I don't want to write class boundaries because if I put class boundaries down there, the person who's looking at my graph has no idea what the graph is referencing. Doesn't know if it's weights or heights or whatever the case may be. So I need to be more descriptive than that. All right, so I'm going to go back to the problem just for a second. It says a local college wants to study SAT scores for incoming freshmen. A sample of 75 students was chosen. So these numbers that we have are SAT scores. I'm going to use that for my label down here. Again, you don't want to use class boundaries because it's just not descriptive enough. Okay, so let me ask you guys a question. I know I'm going to put the frequency on the other axis. Sometimes what I see students do is they take these numbers for the frequency, and they do usually put them in order, but they just, and don't write this down, just look at it for a second, but they mark them off. So they say 5, 11, 19, or 17, 17 there, 19, and 23. Okay. And I know that they do that because that is the same thing that we did for the boundaries. We took the actual numbers for the boundaries and we marked them off. So I guess it stands to reason that we could do the same thing for the frequency. All right, so why can't I do that? Why is that wrong? Anybody know? No? Anybody at home have an idea why I can't mark them off like that? Okay, so they're not equally spaced. The distance from 17 to 19 is 2, right? The distance from 5 to 11 is 6. So when I mark something off, it has to be equally spaced. So what about the boundaries? Are they equally spaced? Yes, because these limits, that we have right here, they're equally spaced. Remember that how we set that up, we talked about that on Wednesday, how every class had to have the same width. Okay, so if your limits are equally spaced, your boundaries are equally spaced. So that's not a problem, but the frequency, you can't do it like this. All right, so I need a scale to mark off these numbers. I need to count by something. All right, so what can I count by? Anybody want to come up with something? Let's see, we need to go at least to 23. So maybe we count by what? And you can mark them off one by one. You can count by twos, you can count by threes, you can count by fours. What might be a good thing to count by? And there's not a right or wrong answer. What do you guys want to do? Threes, okay. All right, so we can count by threes. All right, so let's do this. All right, so I'm gonna go 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, and 24. All right, you just want something that's consistent, and you need it to go higher than your highest number. So if your highest number is 23, you need to be sure that you get past that or at least to that value. Okay, now for a label here, I am going to just be very generic and just put an F. All right, so to right on there. All right. There we go. All right, so an F somewhere on that side. F stands for frequency. And again, as long as you've been descriptive on the bottom where you wrote SAT scores, then it's okay to be a little more generic on the side. All right, and then we're ready to draw this thing. All right, so we are going to draw bars. Remember that we're talking about a bar graph. So the first bar is going to start at 799.5, so it's starting here. It's going to end at 874.5, so it's going to end here. Sorry guys, the TV is just not working great for me this morning. Okay, so end right here, and it's going to go up to a height of 11, all right? So I need to come up a little bit higher on these things. And then come across and down. All right, so that's what the first bar is going to look like, starting at 799.5, ending at 874.5, going up to 11. All right, so my next one starts at 874.5, so it's going to kind of butt up against the first one, right up against it, no spacing in between. It's going to have a height of 19. So I'm going to pull this up. A little bit higher, across, and down. All right, third one has a height of 23, right? So again, right up against it, up to 23. And then the next one's at 17. And the last one is at 5. All right, any questions on drawing it? So you want to be thinking, am I able to take a problem, find the boundaries, find the frequency if I weren't given it, and then set up a histogram? Everybody feel okay with that? All right, anybody at home with a question? Okay. All right, so let's go back and let's look at the next one. All right, so our next one is what's called a frequency polygon.
Can you go back so I can take a picture?
There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the next one, frequency polygon. Again, we're going to make it a little bit easier by saying that it is a type of line graph. All right, so this one has on the x-axis what are called the class midpoints. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about that. That's gonna go on the x-axis. And then it still has the frequencies on the y. Okay, so we need midpoints and frequencies. Let's take a look at our problem. We're gonna use the same problem. All right, midpoints and frequencies. Okay, so I have the frequency column. That's gonna be good. I'm gonna need to add a column for midpoints. All right, so somewhere on your example, add one more column in there for me. All right, so midpoints is pretty much what it sounds like. It is the center point in the class. So it is the middle number between 800 and 874 in the beginning. Okay. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to take those two numbers, the 800 and the 874, and we're going to add them together. Then we're going to divide by 2. Okay, so it's kind of like finding an average between your two endpoints. Okay, so 800 plus 874 divided by 2 gives you what?
837.
837. And then do a little check and make sure that that makes sense. I mean, you're shooting for a number in between 800 and 874. So should you come up with something that's not, then you maybe did it wrong on your calculator. Okay, 837 is what you should get. And we keep doing that on all 4 of the remaining classes. Okay, so the next one is going to be 875 plus 949. And then we're going to divide that result by 2. All right, what do we get there? 912, good. All right, any questions as you're doing those? I'm gonna let you guys finish them. Anybody have a problem not getting it at home? All right, so go ahead and calculate the last 3 for me. All right, 987 for the next one. $10.62, is that right? 1137? Okay. All right, anybody have a question there? Getting those midpoints.
We okay, so we added 800 plus 74 divided into 2, and that give us our midpoint.
800 plus 874, yes, so you're gonna divide those two, or add those two numbers together, and then divide by 2.
Okay, and we do that for each one, right? Like we do 875 minus 949 divided by 2.
Yeah, add them, but yes, for each one. Okay. Do what? You rounded to 4? I don't think so. Try it again. 1025 plus 1099. Got it. All right, anybody else question? Okay, so now we've got midpoints, we've got frequency. All right, so we're ready to go draw our graph on this one. All right. Okay, so So again, I just kind of pulled this over so we can look at it again. All right, we're going to draw the graph to go with it. All right, so remember that the midpoints go across the bottom. So we have 5 midpoints and we'll do 5 tick marks. All right, the one thing that's a little tricky about the frequency polygon is you need some extra space at the beginning and some extra space at the end. So when I mark off my tick marks, I might do something like that so that I end up with extra room here and also extra room at the back side, okay? Just be sure that you leave that spacing in the front and also at the end. All right, so I'm going to write down my midpoints real quick here. So I've got 837, 912, 987, 1062, 1137. Okay, we need a label down there just like we had before. Again, you don't want to write the word midpoint because it's not descriptive enough. So go back to your data, figure out what you're talking about, and then use that SAT scores that we used the last one. Okay, for frequency, we can really do the same thing that we did on the histogram. We don't need any extra space, all right? We do it just like we did before. Before we said we were going to count by 3s, so that will continue to work. Again, no extra space at the beginning on this one. Let's just mark off that scale of 3. And we'll put an F beside it to stand for frequency. All right, so this is a line graph, so we're going to plot points. All right, so above the 837, we're going to go up to 11, and I'm going to put a dot. All right, and then above the 912, I'm going to put a dot at 19. And those two are going to get connected with the straight line. Okay, so we'll kind of connect as we go. All right, the third one, we're going to be at the third one, we're going to be at 987 and up to 23. So place your dot and then connect. Okay, above the 1062, you're going to be at 17. And then finally at 5. Okay, so now the reason for the extra space. All right, so on a frequency polygon, you are going to bring both ends of your graph back down to the x-axis. And you're going to do that at the previous tick mark and the next tick mark. So you're going to think to yourself, if I had one more tick mark coming out here, okay, there was one more using the same spacing that I've been using, it would be like here, right? So I'm going to take my graph and I'm going to pull it down to that point, and then I'm going to erase that tick mark because it's not really supposed to be there. I'm just kind of using it as a guide. And then I'm gonna do the same thing in the front. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of imagine where a tick mark would have been if I had done one before the 837, probably right about here. I'm gonna bring my graph down to that point, and then I'm gonna erase that tick mark. Okay, and you wanna be careful because your graph should not come down and hit that corner point. If it does, you didn't leave any extra space. Okay, so you want that graph kind of pushed out to the right a little bit, not coming back and touching the origin. All right, any questions on that one? Okay. All right, so I'm going to back up and let's go do the third graph. All right, so the third graph is called an ogive. It's spelled a little weird because it has that G in it, an ogive. It is also a line graph. But it does different kinds of information, okay? So on the x-axis, we're going back to the boundaries. And on the y-axis, we're going to do cumulative frequency. All right, so let's look at our example. All right, so we need boundaries, which we have. And we need cumulative frequency, which we don't. So let's add one more column to that example for cumulative frequency. Okay, so do you guys remember how this works? We talked about this with the frequency distributions the other day. All right, so we said that you wanted to start the top row with the same number that's in the frequency. So if I have 11 right here, the first cumulative frequency value is also going to be 11. And then we do like a running total as we go down through the classes. So we have 11. We're going to pick up 19 more values as we move to the next class. So 11 plus 19 is going to give me 30. And then we move to the next class and we pick up 23 more numbers. So that makes the total 53. Pick up 17 more, we're going to be at 70. Pick up 5 more, we'll be at 75. All right, so now we have the cumulative frequencies and the boundaries that we need for our graph. All right, so let's look at drawing this last one. Okay, so again, I pulled over what we need. All right, boundaries. We're going to mark those off on the bottom just like we did on the histogram. Okay, so 6 tick marks because we have 5 classes. We're going to equally space these. the best we can. No extra space needed. We're going to write down those boundaries. Remember, no duplications. So we start with the 799.5. And the next one is 874.5. The next different number is 949.5. Okay, you want to label there, just like before. We don't want to use class boundaries because it is not descriptive enough. So we're going to say SAT scores. That's what our data is. All right, so cumulative frequencies, excuse me, go up the Y. The biggest cumulative frequency is 75, so I need to get at least to 75. I don't think I want to count by threes because it would just be too many, right? Okay, so give me something else. Maybe fives. Even that might be a little bit too much. I think I'm going to do tens maybe, just to cut down on how many tick marks. Okay, you could definitely do fives, but that would mean 15 tick marks, which might just be a little bit much. All right, so I'm just going to count by tens here. Now we need to go to 80. And then you can just put CF over there, okay? If you've been descriptive on the x-axis, then you can put just CF for cumulative frequency on the y. Okay, so we're going to do a line graph. A line graph means we're plotting points. All right, so the problem is on this one, if I'm going to put a point, I've got to decide where to put the point if the class goes from 799.5 to 874.5. Okay? It's not like I can do a bar and start here and end here and span the whole class, because I'm just going to do one dot. All right, so the question is, where does that dot go? All right, and the answer lies in the fact that you're doing cumulative frequency. So the fact that that's 11, think about your actual numbers. Would you assume that, like if I put my point here, then basically what that says is by the time I get to 799.5, which is really at the beginning of the class, I will have picked up all 11 values. Do you think that's true? Do you think that all 11 of the values are 799.5? No. Okay. So I'm not doing that. Okay. Students also sometimes will tell me, well, what about if we do it in the middle? Okay, between the two. So that would mean that by the time you got to the middle of the class, that you covered all 11 values. That there are no values that are bigger than the midpoint. Do you think that's true? Probably not, right? Okay, so I'm not going to do that either. All right, what if I put it at the end? If I put it at the end, that means that by the time you get to 874.5, by the time you get to the end of the class, you've seen all 11 values. That's true. Okay. So what I want you to do on this one, because this is a little bit hard to remember, is make yourself a note in your notes and say that the points are plotted at the end of each class. Okay, and that'll just help you remember when you're working homework or you're working on a test problem or whatever, that that's where your point needs to be at the end of the class. All right, so once you have the first one, the rest of them sort of follow. The next one's going to be at 30. It's going to be above the 949.5. That's the end of that class. And remember, on a line graph, we'll sort of connect as we go. The next point should be at 53. The next one at 70. And the last one at 75. Okay, and so it looks good, except for there's nothing at the 799.5. So as far as the running total goes, in the very beginning, before you even started the first class at 800, you would probably assume that that running total was set at 0. And then you started picking up those numbers. All right, so to show that, I'm going to take this and pull it down to the 799.5. I don't do that on the other end because cumulative frequency should never decrease. Okay, cumulative frequency can level off and stay the same, or more likely, these numbers keep getting bigger as you keep adding to it. All right, any questions there?